Of course, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is central to the Christian faith. And as Christians, we want to make a historical case that Jesus lived, that he was crucified, that he was buried, and that he rose again. And Travis, I appreciate that you're here helping me to know how to make an argument, a good argument for the historical Jesus. And it's interesting to me that both non-Christian and Christian scholars alike agree upon 10 facts about Jesus' life. And in a previous episode, we spent some time talking in detail about 3 of those. And so in this episode, we'd like to talk about 3 more. So could you go ahead and give us some more details about, again, the agreed upon historical facts about Jesus?
Sure. The next 3 facts I think we should talk about are Jesus' radical personal claims, his extraordinary deeds, and then his crucifixion. And I'll kind of start with the crucifixion and go reverse. The crucifixion is an anchor for historical Jesus studies. This, as Paula Fredrickson says, is the most well-established fact about Jesus. And so unless you're dealing with a Christ mythicist or maybe a Muslim apologist, because the Quran says that Jesus was not crucified, you're not going to find a New Testament scholar or an ancient historian who denies that Jesus died by means of crucifixion. And one of the reasons why historians accept the crucifixion as a fact is because it's multiply attested, as I've said many times before. It's also embarrassing. The criterion of embarrassment comes in strong here because why would a group of Jewish disciples go around proclaiming that their Messiah, the divine Son of God, had experienced a crucifixion? The mode of crucifixion, the mode of death that we call crucifixion, was so painful, horrendous, horrible, and so forth, that the Roman elite never really referred to it. So it's interesting that when Tacitus talks about Jesus' execution, he uses the word execution. He doesn't talk about explicitly crucifixion. It's in Josephus and in the Gospels and in Paul's writings that we learn that Jesus really was crucified. It's very hard to get a religion started in the first place. It's doubly hard to get a religion started if your hero died this embarrassingly horrible and cruel death where you were impaled on a cross, totally stripped, totally naked, for all to see as you hung there in agonizing pain and then were thrown into a tomb.
I mean, isn't that a reason why Muslims are very uncomfortable with the idea of the crucifixion? How could a prophet of God be subjected to that type of death, that Allah would never allow one of his prophets to die that way?
Exactly. In fact, there was an early, in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, there was a group of people who were in the visible church called Gnostics, and they actually denied the crucifixion for that very reason. And so the question that historians can raise is, what's more likely? That the 2nd century denials of the crucifixion are authentic, and that somehow the church made up the story of the crucifixion later, or that the crucifixion is the original story, and then after decades and decades of being abused and made fun of over this doctrine, someone came along and made up a different story where either Jesus was not crucified because Judas was crucified in his place, or Jesus and Christ aren't the same person, as some Gnostics believed, so that when Jesus was being crucified, the Christ spirit left his body and sat on a fence and literally laughed at those who were crucifying Jesus, saying, "You're not really doing this." It's far easier to say that the original story, the original fact is crucifixion, and that these later explanations came along. And the Quran does build off of these Gnostic gospels. The Gnostics who produce gospels saying that the crucifixion didn't happen make their way into the Quran. And this is why most Muslims hold to a kind of substitutionary theory that someone was crucified in Jesus' place. Now, once you say that Jesus was crucified, you have to ask yourself the question, what was this man doing to deserve crucifixion? And if you look at Luke's gospel in particular, it becomes really evident as to exactly what was going on here, and this is why he was crucified. Why would the Sanhedrin give Jesus over to be crucified, or give them over to Pontius Pilate to render judgment as to whether he deserved to die? Because at his trial itself, Jesus was asked, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting in the clouds of glory and coming with the power of God." And this is Darrell Bacchus said is a theological train wreck. What Jesus said is blasphemous to Jewish ears, and this is why they give him over. However, when they give him over to Pilate, what do they accuse Jesus of claiming when they give him over to Pilate? Did they say, this man claims to be the Son of God? No, because in Roman society, claiming to be divine is no big deal. So what they did is they beefed up his claim to be the Messiah, which is a royal claim as well as a prophetic one. And so when they said, this man claims to be the Messiah, they are saying, hey, this man claims to be king of the Jews, and we have no king but Caesar. And that's why Pilate felt the pressure to eventually scourge Jesus and have him crucified. So I think that the radical personal claims we find Jesus making in the Gospels is the best explanation for why he was crucified in the first place. And it's interesting that even the Radical Jesus Seminar, which was a group of radical scholars that met in the 80s and 90s, and they voted on what they think Jesus did and said, and they started with the assumption that the New Testament is unreliable, and therefore every statement we see of Jesus is guilty until proven innocent. The Radical Jesus Seminar itself accepts certain claims that Jesus made as authentic. So for example, in Luke 11:20, when Jesus says, if I cast out demons by the finger of God, you know that the kingdom of God has come upon you. That is an inherently messianic claim, where Jesus is saying that in himself the kingdom of God is being revealed to you. And it's also interesting that a growing number of scholars, I can't claim that the majority of scholars say this, but a growing number of scholars are granting that Jesus said something like what we find in Matthew 11:27. In Matthew 11:27, Jesus says, no one knows the Father but the Son, and no one knows the Son but the Father, and all to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Jesus is actually saying that he comprehends the mind of God, and that he is the Son who alone knows the Father. This is a radical claim. Some people have called this the Johannine thunderbolt, because only in John's Gospel do we usually find Jesus making such explicit claims to deity. But here in Matthew chapter 11, we see Jesus making a very similar claim. I am equal to God the Father, he's saying. And the reason why a lot of scholars believe that this is an authentic saying of the historical Jesus is because it passes the criterion of dissimilarity. Later Christian theology tells us that we can know the Son. So it's very difficult to imagine the church putting on the lips of Jesus the notion that we cannot know the Son. And so that's why many scholars, and a growing number of scholars, think that Jesus actually said that sort of thing. So we have Jesus making claims to deity. We have Jesus making claims to be the Messiah. We have these claims passing these criteria that we've been talking about. And we have these claims as the best explanation for why he was crucified. And the very fact that Jesus is going around saying, if I cast out demons by the finger of God, you know that the kingdom of God has come upon you, that gives us an indication to think that Jesus really was doing something extraordinary. And so the extraordinary deeds of Jesus are granted by the majority of scholars. As the Jesus Seminar says, Jesus healed at least one blind man. Whereas Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, says, Jesus must have been a wonderful healer. That's a paraphrase. But he says, I take the traditions of Jesus going around doing these kinds of radical healings as history remembered. In other words, he's affirming the historicity of these healings that Jesus did. That doesn't prove that Jesus was doing miracles, but it does prove that Jesus was doing something very extraordinary. And so the facts of Jesus' radical claims, the fact of his extraordinary deeds, and the fact of the crucifixion, these are facts that are very well attested by the evidence, and that's why they're accepted by the majority of scholars.